Hey guys, Flash here with my first of hopefully many New World videos. Today I'd like to take a moment to discuss my favorite weapon in New World currently, the Hatchet. I'd like to go over my thoughts and some of the pros and cons of the weapon in both PvE and PvP. I'd like to discuss some of my thoughts on potential builds and ability priority, and discuss some potential weapon pairings, and ultimately ask the question, should you use the Hatchet in New World? I do eventually plan to cover all of the weapons in New World, but so far the Hatchet's the only weapon that I've been able to get to the max level of weapon mastery, level 20, in my time of playing, so it's the only one I feel confident discussing at length as of right now. Just as a disclaimer before we get started too, this all comes from my experience using the Hatchet, myself up to about level 41 over the course of about 100 hours of gameplay, so I'm sure I'll get some things wrong or I'll miss some key things for some of you other hardened Hatchet users, so if I do miss anything, please feel free to let me know in the comments and we can have a little bit of a discussion. So, what does the Hatchet actually do and what is it good at? The Hatchet's a very fast attacking weapon that benefits from attacking persistently and often without stopping. This means that personally when I use the Hatchet, I find myself only really dodging big hits and not very often, and never blocking even to the point of fully removing my block in favor of the Hatchet throw ability, which we'll discuss more later. All this makes the Hatchet something of a higher risk but higher reward weapon, with some of the highest persistent DPS that I've personally seen on any weapon in New World so far. The big drawback to this is that the Hatchet has minimal healing and no life-stealing abilities to keep your health topped up while farming enemies or fighting other players, so you will be relying on food, potions, or a secondary weapon like the Great Axe to stay at full HP, unless you can properly manage your health with the one heal that the Hatchet does have on the Berserk ability. So, speaking of Berserker, this is the skill tree that I recommend that you go down for both PvE and PvP. Now, this is just my build. I'm not sure if the build is optimal or not, but I'll discuss my choices here, and you can let me know in the comments if I'm sleeping on a really strong ability, or maybe I'm overhyping a mediocre one. So on the Berserker tree, you have a good set of abilities for burst damage and survivability. Your first ability, Berserk, is basically a buff that gives you 20% attack for 12 seconds, and with upgrades it also gives you movement speed, it gives you % max health healing over time, it gives you a full cleanse, which removes crowd control effects, which is extremely useful in PvP, and it even gives you a passive that makes all of your attacks uninterruptible, which is very, very helpful for fighting groups of enemies and keeping from being staggered and dishing out a lot of DPS. Something really interesting about the Berserk ability is that it has a secondary passive where if you have a Carnelian gem equipped in your Hatchet, then you actually gain a taunt ability on all nearby enemies for 8 seconds when Berserk is used. This is a really useful ability when handling large groups of enemies with a group of players, say in a corruption event, or in a dungeon like Amarin or in the Depths. You can take the heat off of your allies, and you really shouldn't have any trouble taking this heat yourself, especially if you have a healer, but even without, you should be able to deal with a group of enemies and survive long enough with Berserk heal and the Undying passive, which we'll get to dodge back and pop a health potion, or whatever you need to do to stay alive. By no means does this mean I think that the Hatchet is an amazing tank weapon just because of the taunt and the small window of invulnerability if you would take lethal damage, but it is something useful to be able to do in a group setting, and it does play into the Hatchet's strengths. Next ability to look at here is Feral Rush. Feral Rush is going to be your gap closer. When you use it, you lunge forward and swing your Hatchet twice, and with upgrades it can do more damage to lower health enemies, and it can also, if you hit your target in the back, it can root them in place for 2 seconds. That's pretty useful in PvP, but not particularly useful in PvE. This ability is good for getting in the last hit on someone who's running away, trying to pop a health potion, or eat some food to try and get a heal off, and it's really good ability to throw into your damage rotation at the end, even when you don't need the gap close, because it can stagger enemies, as well as do a large amount of damage to lower health enemies for a potential execute. And lastly here we have Raging Torrent. Raging Torrent lets you attack 4 times in rapid succession, and with upgrades it gives you a 20% haste buff on hits, and will allow you to do a 5th harder hit at the end of the ability by adding in an extra light attack. Something important to note with Raging Torrent and Feral Rush both is that you can use them as sort of an animation cancel on a regular light attack, right? So you can light attack and then immediately use the ability after the light attack lands, and you'll go right into your Raging Torrent ability, let's say, and then when you come out of it, you use another light attack, and then you can immediately go into your Feral Rush. And it's a good way to squeeze in extra damage, while minimizing kind of the time between your attacks. It speeds up the rate at which you can hit an enemy, which just adds to your overall DPS. So now I'll go over what I feel are some of the more important passives that I take, which don't directly augment your abilities. The first one is probably the most obvious one, and that's the keystone here, Defy Death. So, Defy Death basically says that when you would take lethal damage, instead you stay at 50 health for 3 seconds and cannot be killed until those 3 seconds are up. This passive is incredible for the Hatchet because it lets you play a lot more aggressively in both PvE and PvP than you normally would, and that is something that plays to the Hatchet's relentless aggressive strengths. I can't tell you guys how many PvP fights I would have lost if it weren't for those extra 3 seconds of damage that I get to put out, or the passive just saving me from a random death blow and letting me back up and heal. Even in PvE, I've often found myself biting off a little bit more than I can chew with large groups of high-level enemies, and this passive often saves me a run back from a bad case of overconfidence. The next most important passive, from what I've experienced, that actually pairs really well with Defy Death is Against All Odds. This passive lets you do 10% more damage for each enemy that is within 5 meters of you, and from what I can tell, it does not have a cap on how high this can stack. If 10 enemies are on you, and then you'll be doing double damage and so on. But even against just one enemy in melee range is a flat 10% damage increase, which is not bad at all. Combination of this and Defy Death has won me a lot of fights that I had no business winning because I get swarmed by high-level enemies or I'm fighting multiple players at once, and in 3 seconds of undying with uninterruptible attacks from Berserk and a massive damage boost from multiple enemies near me with Against All Odds, I can manage to either kill off all of the enemies or just enough of them that I can get away from the remaining enemies and heal. It's a really, really, really good combination that can save you in a lot of otherwise lethal scenarios. The rest of the passives are either for more damage or damage resistance, or even another DOT cleanse, right? But real quick, let's talk about the skills that I didn't take and why I didn't take them. So, first up is this one, Relentless Fury. And don't get me wrong, Relentless Fury is a great ability by all means, right? It's a 30% damage increase for either 3 seconds or 4 attacks, whichever comes first. But it's only able to be triggered by a heavy attack. And personally, I really don't like doing heavy attacks with the Hatchet. I feel like it slows your down your assault pretty significantly and overall reduces your DPS by adding in a longer animation on one of your swings. And it's not the most reliable to be able to connect that swing in PvP with a player jumping around you and dodging. So it doesn't really fit my playstyle, but the one way that I could see you using this, and how I would recommend you to use it if you do take this ability, is to try to land a heavy attack right before you go into a Raging Torrent. That's your 4 hit. If you land all 4 hits, it's going to be doing massive damage in one very quick burst, which could really catch somebody off guard. And for PvE, this is not really going to be an issue, right? You're going to be able to get your heavy attack off as long as you just remember to do it. But for PvP, it might be a little bit trickier unless someone is really sticking to you in melee range, which, in that case, you're probably going to be okay anyway. That's what you want, is the Hatchet. The other ability I'm not taking here is Desperate Refresh, which I haven't tested admittedly, but it just doesn't seem very good to me. It only works when you're low health, and it only refreshes 2% of your ability cooldowns per hit, which isn't much. And granted, one of the Hatchet's biggest weaknesses is longer cooldowns on the abilities, which can leave you vulnerable if they miss and they're on cooldown for a long period of time, but I don't think this ability is the solution to that problem. Alright, so over in the throwing tree, I like taking the aimed throw and critical throw abilities. The aimed throw is basically just replaces your block with an aimed throw, so you can hold right mouse button to aim your axe and then throw it. It doesn't go very far, it has kind of a steep arc, but it is a good ranged option, especially for PvE farming, and it's helpful for harassing and finishing off enemies in PvP as well. The other ability here is Critical Throw, which just allows your thrown axe to be able to do headshot damage as well as crit, because otherwise it cannot. But interestingly, it also increases the critical hit chance of just all attacks by 5%. So that's a really good passive to have. It adds a lot of damage to your rotation. As far as the rest of the skill tree goes, there's definitely some good stuff in there. You can apply a lot of debuffs and extend them with the throwing tree, but I feel like if you want a ranged damage option, you'd just be better off going with a musket or an ice gauntlet or a fire staff or something like that. The Hatchet definitely excels better up close, and there are better ranged options as far as weapons go from what I've experienced so far. So, on the topic of ability rotation, Generally, what I would recommend is popping your Berserk before you use your other abilities for the extra damage, the extra haste, and also the uninterruptible attacks, but there's no shame in saving it for a cleanse if you feel like you're going to need it, depending on what enemy you're fighting, or if you're fighting a player, what type of weapons they are using. But generally, ignoring the need to remove crowd control effects, I would recommend using Berserk first, then doing one light attack, and immediately going into your Raging Torrent ability, that's the 4-hit, adding the 5th hit at the end, doing one more light attack, and then going into your Feral Rush for 9 hits total. And that looks a little something like this. It's a very quick and lethal combo, pumps out a whole lot of damage, and ultimately it's going to either really burst somebody very hard in PvP if they don't get out of the way, or it's going to take out most enemies or most groups of enemies in PvE farming. Using this build, the Hatchet's a phenomenal PvE farming weapon. It's able to handle large groups of higher level enemies all at once without really the fear of dying, and only needing a few good swings to take out the whole group at once. Without even regarding your secondary weapon, the Hatchet's also a menace at close range in PvP as well. Admittedly, the Hatchet has some very major PvP drawbacks. Longer cooldowns on your skills leave you vulnerable when your abilities are not available, and for a relatively large window of time. If an enemy can capitalize on you missing your abilities or whiffing a combo, they can probably outdamage you and kill you even with your Undying passive up, depending on the weapons that they're using and how tuned in their build is. Also, the Hatchet really only has one gap closer with the Feral Rush, and like I said, it's on kind of a long cooldown, and it doesn't lunge you very far. So highly mobile weapons like the Great Axe or the Spear, or weapons with a lot of slows like the Ice Gauntlet, can run away from you, or just run circles around you and make it very hard to get onto them, even with all the haste passives that the Hatchet gets. The Hatchet isn't really a good weapon for retreating from combat either, because the move speed that you get from Berserk is short-lived, can be overtaken by dashes, crowd control effects, and you have no real other way to slow your enemy down other than by hitting them in the back with Feral Rush for a 2-second root, and that's not very practical to hit an enemy in the back who is chasing you. So if you get caught out while using the Hatchet, your best bet is to fight it out. It's probably your best chance of survival, although not much is going to save you from a large gank squad. You may get 1 or 2 of them, but you'll probably still go down in the end. Yeah, there wasn't much I was going to be able to do there. Some more positive talking points for the Hatchet for PvP is that it does seem to be a bit of a natural counter to a Rapier and to a Great Axe in a 1v1, because your Undying passive lets you take the burst damage that both of those weapons are capable of dealing out, and win in the end through persistent DPS, and Berserk can be used strategically to remove crowd control effects like the riposte on the Rapier, and also the traps and snares on the Great Axe. The axe is also all about grabbing enemies into melee range and keeping them there, which is exactly what you want when you're playing with the Hatchet, because that's where you're going to perform the best in a fight. That said, almost nothing seems to be able to really out-DPS a Hatchet with all abilities up in a one-on-one fight at melee range, at least not that I've seen yet, which makes it a really solid option for open-world PvP skirmishes and one-on-one battles, but it's definitely not as great for dealing with gank squads or large-scale fort battles or wars. It does better on a smaller scale, for sure. So, if you are someone like myself who uses the Hatchet, or I've maybe convinced you to try it out, which weapon should you pair with the Hatchet? What should you use as your secondary? Well, ultimately anything that shares a scaling with the Hatchet is a viable option, which is a lot of weapons considering that the Hatchet has a major scaling in strength, and also a minor scaling in dexterity. That covers a lot of the weapons in the game. Focusing your attribute points is very important for any build, not just with the Hatchet. Making sure that both of your weapons share a scaling is very, very important just to any build success, unless you're purely using a secondary for utility purposes and substats. So for PvE, one of my best recommendations would be to use a bow with your Hatchet. This gives you a bit of a ranged option, and it also allows you to take advantage of the bow's haste passives, which will let you get around the map faster. Basically, the way that this works is if you take... Let me pull this up real quick. If you take these abilities in the bow tree, the after dodge gain 10% haste for 2 seconds, and gain 10% haste for 5 seconds when you swap to your bow on a 10-second cooldown, you can pair these to get a 20% movement speed boost while just running around the map. As you can see there on my screen, you can see the little haste buffs. So this will let you get around the map a lot faster, and ultimately will allow you to reach your quest objectives quicker, and turn in your quests quicker, get from town to town faster without having to teleport and waste your A's off, which does mean that ultimately you're going to be getting more XP per hour, and all of that good stuff. One side note about using a secondary weapon that has a minor scaling in common with the hatchet instead of the major scaling. I haven't noticed much of an issue with this in my gameplay so far. I have been investing almost fully into dexterity. This is the current attribute spread that I'm working with, almost 200 dexterity to only 60 strength. And you can see here, the bow only scales dexterity, so that was the reason why I wanted to go into the spread. And my hatchet's damage is not far off from my bow's damage. They're relatively comparable, and I don't notice too much of a loss in damage by scaling into dexterity, and I don't think you will either. It's actually kind of mind-boggling to think that the hatchet can even do more damage scaling into strength instead, because it already does so much as is. So, for a PvP, or for more of a strength-focused PvE build, or just something a little bit more optimal, I would recommend a Great Axe secondary with the hatchet, and this is a bit of a thought child build because I haven't actually tried it yet, but conceptually it seems to work out very well, and I have seen other players using it. So the crowd control and pulls on the Great Axe can snag enemies and bring them into your melee range, where once you run up to them you can freely beat them down with the hatchet without worrying about them getting away from you, and you can use the healing abilities on the Great Axe to help with the hatchet's relative lack of sustain, while still being pretty tanky and wanting to be in that fight and taking damage. When paired, these weapons complement each other beautifully. Their only downside is the lack of range, which the Great Axe's dash and the hatchet's throw can sort of make up for. It still won't be as good as, say, having an ice gauntlet, or a musket, or a bow, but it will probably do the job that you need it to, and if you rush in there and you get within melee range, you're going to be very effective. And those are my thoughts on the hatchet. It's currently my favorite weapon. I got to try most of the weapons in the open beta, and the hatchet really stood out head and shoulders above pretty much all of the other weapons that I tried, and I knew once the game launched that I'd be using it primarily. So far, I feel like it's been performing extremely well. I've used it for the bulk of my 100 hours of New World so far. So, should you use the hatchet? Well, if you ask me, absolutely. It's a lot of fun. It's a very different, aggressive playstyle, and maybe you're somebody who's just not a big fan of the melee weapon that they chose to go with. Maybe you don't feel like it's doing quite enough damage for you. Maybe you want to pump out more DPS in dungeons, or maybe you're a caster looking to swap over to a melee weapon and you don't know which one. Well, if you have liked what you've seen here and you think that it seems interesting, maybe consider giving the hatchet a try. It might be something that you really, really enjoy. Alright guys, if you enjoyed the video or you learned anything new about the hatchet today, please consider liking the video. It really helped me out. And if you want to see more weapon analysis, tips, tricks, guides, and much more for New World, then be sure to subscribe and turn on that notification bell to be notified when I upload a new video. And if you have any thoughts on my analysis or any additional advice for hatchet users, or maybe even people who are struggling to fight hatchet users in PvP, or if you think that I got anything in my analysis wrong, then please leave me a comment below this video. I'd love to hear your feedback and start a little bit of a discussion. And I'm really new to YouTube as I am to New World, so any feedback on the video itself is also appreciated. I know that the editing is a bit jump cutty. I'm sorry about that. And one last thing before you guys go, I stream on Twitch over at twitch.tv/FlashKillerX. That's where the bulk of my content is, and I do a lot better in a live format. So if you're interested, I'm currently streaming pretty much only New World, but I also stream Dark Souls stuff from time to time. Most recently, I was working on a Broken Sword challenge run for Dark Souls 1 while waiting for New World to release, and in the future I have some plans for Starfield and Elden Ring when those games come out. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, or you'd like to come hang out and chat with me, I would encourage you to check out my Twitch channel and toss me a follow. It would mean the world to me. I'll have a link in my description below. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video, you guys, and I hope to see you next time. Oh, alright, well, this is a game changer. Alright, fuck everything I just said. Hatchet is the best weapon in New World, hands down. Absolutely 100%, 10 out of 10, objectively best weapon in the game right here.